Hey everyone, welcome to the Renovation Theory podcast. On this podcast and in our community, we are working to break down walls through authentic conversation. We're glad you joined us today. We are your hosts. I'm Pat, and this is Britt.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about, I guess it's kind of a reaction to a few of our own podcasts and a few other things, but whether or not it's good or even possible to compartmentalize conversations, or if we need to talk about kind of all the sub-tentacles of issues that come out.
Compartmentalization is the word I was using when we were talking about this episode and planning it. And it kind of came out of a couple different things for me. And the reason why I want to talk about it is mostly in reaction to last week's episode about protests. We used Colin Kaepernick and his protest and the Nike ads to talk about how protests are viewed and how we protest things in today's society. But there were a lot of things that played into that with the whole protests and political side and patriotism side and racial side. And so we kind of almost got off on a bunch of different rabbit trails as we were trying to stay focused on protests as our topic for last week, but also a couple conversations that you and I have had outside the podcast, and some conversations I've had with people on Facebook in general too. I want to use this as a learning experience for me personally and for us as we host this podcast, just how best to have these conversations. And the big question is, can we separate all of these different issues within the conversation that we're having to focus on one of them? Is that even possible? I mean, based on last week's episode, I'm not sure that it fully is. Or more than that, is it healthy? Is it helpful in a conversation to separate those things? Sure. So one of the conversations that I had fairly recently, a few weeks ago now, was around the Serena Williams U.S. Open final match. A friend of mine shared an article on Facebook that was a really well-written article, but the critique I had of it was that, so in that situation, you've got it's a tennis issue, how the rules were officiated in tennis. It's definitely a gender issue, how females in sports and work are perceived, and there's also a racial issue with Serena Williams and Naomi Osaka being black. And the article, I felt, took a stance on two of those issues really well and just kind of tagged on the issue of race in that situation. And it kind of, I felt it piled on, and it didn't necessarily need to add that argument in there. And I fully realize I am a white male saying this, but I'm just wondering, in my mind, the way I kind of think about this is that it's three different issues, or as we were talking about Colin Kaepernick, it's a number of different issues. So is it helpful for us to talk about those separately? Can we have, in the Serena Williams case, a conversation about tennis, and then a conversation about females versus males in sports, and then a conversation around race in sports?
Right. And I think, so you'll find very quickly that Pat and I feel very differently about this. And, there have been a lot of different instances that I've seen too. So going, there's the tennis Serena Williams issue, and then I was on a Facebook thread last night about the Ford Kavanaugh hearings, and that quickly diverged into basically a defining white privilege conversation. That was at least part of the thread. So it's I think where I feel specifically related, or using the Serena Williams example as a starting point, is that we, like, if you were just to talk about that from a tennis issue, it's not that important. I mean, it is, and some people might be interested.
For tennis players, it
for
is.
Tennis
For
players,
the rest of the world, probably not.
Yes, you can talk about the tennis issue, and that for several of the articles that I read, that was the beginning point for our podcast. That was the beginning point. But Does that really matter? Does it really impact anybody beyond the tennis world? Probably not. You roll in the gender issue, and I think more people are immediately interested. And then I think the more layers of social issues or concerns or triggers or however you want to define them are present in a single story, the more likely the world at large is to get wrapped up in that story. But also it quickly turns into something that we're not able to have a productive conversation on.
Because people are focused on different aspects of
Everybody has their lane of thing that's most important.
Their trigger point within that story.
Or, however you want it, their, soapbox maybe is not exactly the word, but their platform or their thing that's most important to them.
Right.
And so, you had asked in our discussion yesterday, well, why can't it just be a tennis issue? And I think to me, and I said to you that feels to me like an argument of somebody who's a male, who's white, who doesn't necessarily understand the implications that might be in the undertow. Like, to you, it was interesting because you are somebody who cares about tennis.
Right.
To me, I see some more layers that I want to discuss and talk about, from the emotions piece that we already discussed in episode 5, to just, we were talking a lot about, personality differences. We talked about this in the episode 2, but the personality differences between Naomi Osaka and Serena Williams, and how even the responses of each of those was sort of called out, or can't think of the word I'm looking for. Highlighted or emphasized, I guess, because of the situation they're in. Because whatever your natural tendencies are, they'll probably be exponentially more so when you're in a situation of
big spotlight,
stress and tension and that kind of thing.
Yep.
But for me, I think when I think about this bigger issue of compartmentalizing different things, I think you struggle to answer the real question a lot of times of why things happen. So, going back to the Ford Kavanaugh conversation, there is the issue of assault and sexual violence and all of that needs discussion. And I think that's a topic that outside of the conversation of a specific trial, we need, or not trial, but conversation, in this case, hearing. We need to have that conversation, not with all of the specifics of a certain scenario. And we need to be able to have it in that context, and we're not having it. And I think part of the problem is because we're not having that, the only time we are having that conversation is when there is a specific issue. And for me, it's really hard to untangle that situation from the very obvious facts that he's a person who already is in a seat of power, who is trying to be in a higher seat of power,
right?
Who obviously has a certain amount of sway and influence and connections, and he probably knows some of the people personally that are having really involved in this conversation. And it turns into, this is not simply about the assault. There's no way that we can separate it only to that, because now it's a question about a white male in a seat of power with connections speaking out against somebody who is an unknown female who's, whether or not people want to admit it, somewhat untrusted because nobody's heard of her until now. Granted, she has a lot of clout as far as her credentials, but it's just, for her, that's an uphill battle to fight just to gain that credibility.
But a lot of that talk and the argument and a lot of the stuff that goes into that, I think plays into this whole compartmentalization issue as well, because the hearing was about the alleged sexual assault by Brett Kavanaugh when he and Dr. Ford were in high school. That was the singular thing that this hearing was supposed to talk about. There have been other hearings and other committee meetings and other vetting of Kavanaugh's professional credentials and other stuff around that.
Mm-hmm.
But this hearing was specifically for Dr. Ford to tell her story to the Senate committee, and then for Brett Kavanaugh to have his rebuttal about it. And they tried, well, I shouldn't say they, Dr. Ford tried to keep it about that one issue
Mm-hmm.
and tried to, in terms of this episode, compartmentalize in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Brett Kavanaugh didn't.
Mm-hmm.
He was the one who called out political parties and even called out the Clintons by name
Mm-hmm.
and brought in all of this other stuff and even talked about how this has ruined his family name and got all emotional on the stand, which that's another. I'll back off on that one. But he was the one who muddied the waters
Mm-hmm.
of this one issue that they were trying to compartmentalize, which I guess plays into my thought that we should be able to compartmentalize this. Maybe it's an issue by issue thing, and I'm sure that's
Some of the answer.
some of the answer.
Sure.
You know, it's definitely not a cut and dry rule that we need to or we don't need to all the time. But in this situation, I think Kavanaugh and his camp were wrong in muddying the waters
Mm-hmm.
just to distract from what the singular focus
Mhm.
of this hearing was about. And so
Right.
I think we should be able to compartmentalize some conversations that we have like this.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's like you're basically alluding to pros and cons of each one, and I guess the way your brain works versus my brain works.
I think that's a lot of it too.
Right. So take that into consideration, everybody. I see, being able to come and say, let's have a conversation about what we want, and maybe this is part of it too. So I'm having several thoughts that I'm trying to kind of think through at the same time. But I think there is
Compartmentalize your thoughts. Come on.
I think there is the question of like, are we dealing with a specific issue that we need to solve right now, or are we talking about sexual assault and how to figure it out moving forward?
Like as a big issue, as a
right. Like,
okay.
how are we going to respond to people? How are we going to make sure that people come out earlier in the process so that there's more evidence and support and all of
How
that?
do we, culturally train boys to not be boys
Totally.
in this situation?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I saw a really cool story about like mom teaching a young like toddler consent and how they understand at 3, like, this is not a hard concept. If a girl says she doesn't want to hug, she doesn't want to hug. That's it. No more discussion, no more question. And so like there's a lot of sub pieces, I guess, even there, which is, you get into that whole discussion, but being able to look at the future and say, okay, how do we solve this issue? What are the steps that we can take going forward? And being able to kind of take a bunch of examples in and use that as, I guess, anecdotal evidence in some ways to then build a case for the future, but trying to be more specific about which ones you're using versus when you're looking at a specific issue like a hearing. I feel like there are a lot of issues at play, and being able to look at that and say, what are the different prejudices that each of these people are facing, and how are we taking account for that in real time? And it's really hard to do because there are so many different levers that are being pulled in any specific situation. But I think it's hard to say that, you can't look at a single person and say, you're white and that's the only thing that matters about you.
That's true. And that's where I get the hang up in my mind, because I'm a complex person. But I try to boil these issues down to something that's less complex sometimes in order to wrap my brain around at least a piece of it or something. Maybe that's more it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, they are, I think that people disengage from conversation because it starts to get so complex that the easiest thing is to withdraw. And so I think there is an aspect of how do we keep it from spiraling out of control to the point that, people aren't able to follow the conversation anymore. But then not.
Is that even possible?
I don't know. We're trying, I guess.
Yeah, I guess.
So, I mean, I don't know. It's just I guess my answer is it depends, which is, not a great answer, I guess. But I can see benefits of both trying to compartmentalize in certain circumstances, but then I just don't think you can ever take away the complexity that a lot of these issues represent.
So as I was thinking about this issue and trying to, really, since having that discussion on Facebook, and I was actually called out for my comment on Facebook about the author of that article bringing in the race issue when I felt it was unnecessary. I was called out on it, and I actually left the conversation at that point. The person who posted it actually did a really good job of saying, "Thanks everyone for your comments. We're done now."
Yeah.
Not because it got mean or anything, but just because she felt the conversation had reached a good point to call it quits. But I was called out in that, and so I've been trying to think about this and trying to think, you know, was I wrong in my comment there, or am I wrong in my mindset to try to compartmentalize these issues? And one of the things that I thought about, and I'm this whole episode is me thinking out loud. So I am fully aware that some of this may contradict, but I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to get better, whether that is to compartmentalize or not to compartmentalize for both myself and for our show. But I kept thinking about like cooking shows from Food Network or whatever, when they're trying to compete and you're given these secret ingredients and you're told to make a dish. Some of the contestants, it's one of the things that the judges are always weary about, choose to make 3 different dishes out of the same ingredients. And so the judges always say, "We don't know how to judge this very well because you've made 3 different things for us to judge. One of them was good, one of them was really bad, and one of them was kind of in the middle.
Yeah.
So if we average that out, your dish was mediocre. Where if you would have just served us this one dish, it would have been really, really good, and you probably would have moved on." So part of me thinks that we often do that. The different aspects to some of these discussions and conversations and issues that we're talking about are different dishes, and we're just throwing multiple dishes in there in order to hopefully make some progress and make somebody happy or make somebody mad. But at the same time, I have this thought in the back of my head that it's more like just a stew where all of these issues, that the facets to these issues that we're talking about, are just the main ingredients in a in one dish. Maybe it's not a stew, but in one dish where they're all supposed to mix together, and you can taste different ones at different times, but they're all there all the time.
That's kind of where my mind went, using the same cooking example. It's like, no, the really good dishes that the judges praise are one cohesive dish that uses all the ingredients. And I think that's truly, to me, that's how I see these issues. Is it's almost impossible to separate, in a especially specific situation, all the pieces, and they are all a stew or a dish, or whichever food metaphor resonates with you the most, all pieces of a whole. And just like you have a bunch of complex things about you, I have a bunch of complex things about me, and I don't like it when people say you're just X, you're only X. And so I very much try to highlight a bunch of different pieces of my personality, and I think that's kind of the case with these types of issues. Like, Colin Kaepernick isn't only a protester that wants to stand up for this, and Ford is not only a sexual assault victim, and so it's like, when we talk about it in those terms, it's very obvious.
It's true.
But then when it comes to these issues where multiple people are involved, it gets to be a slippery slope really fast. And I think some of our brains especially, shut down when it's like, but now we have to factor this in, and now we have to factor this in, and now we have to factor this in. And I think a lot of that, to me, comes from that whole mountaintop mentality of there's so many issues that are like you have to be on this side or this side. And so now in a certain circumstance, you have to figure out, let's, take the Kavanaugh Ford example. Are you a Republican or Democrat? Do you believe that we should do something about sexual assault? Do you believe in white privilege? Do you believe in government power to control certain things? And like now, if you have a complex view of the whole situation, you have to figure out where it falls on the map for you, and it starts to get really complicated really fast. And you might find that you don't agree with anybody, or at least any of the major outlets. And that's okay. But I think it's really hard when we feel like we're the one person that has a specific set of beliefs about one issue that isn't highly represented in media.
So is my propensity to compartmentalize in discussions and issues, is that, here we go, psychoanalyzation, analysis. There we go. That's a better word. Is my propensity to compartmentalize an attempt for me to find other people that I agree with, because I know in complex situations I probably won't?
Or?
That's a yes or no question.
I don't know. I thought there was an or.
And I need you to tell me so that I know how to change my life. But no, as you were saying that, if it's a simple A or B issue, we can most likely find other people who are on side A or B. And as we've talked about many times on this podcast, and we'll continue to talk about, it is rarely ever an A or B issue. There's always a middle ground. But when you can compartmentalize it, it makes it easier to pick sides.
Right.
Often.
It can, yeah.
But when you throw in multiple facets of that, even though all of those on their own, in my mind, may be more A-B issues, like we either need to fix this or we don't need to fix this, but you combine 3, 4, 5, 10 of those into one, and you're not going to find anybody probably that's going to agree with you on every single one of those. Call them bullet points under a
not without
issue.
Some kind of quiz that puts everybody to you're in this little bucket. It reminds me of like the personality test, and it's like,
sure,
you're the ENFP of this issue, and you go over here. But anyways, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That's where the complexity lies, and I don't know. I think there is this aspect of, like, when you were talking, I was reminded there is somebody on the thread that I was on about the hearing that was saying basically she wants to assume that they're both right, and until further proof otherwise. And that was really hard for me to think that way, because they can't both be right.
They're saying two completely opposite things.
They're saying things that disagree with each other, so I don't know how they can both be right. But I think that's another form of how to kind of compartmentalize the issue. Like, let's take one side and weigh it against its own merits, and another side and weigh it against its own merits. But I think there's dangers to that too. And so I think to me, it just felt like a way to say, like, I want to be the peacemaker. I don't want to have to choose one way or the other. And I think there's some aspects to me when we talk about compartmentalizing that it feels like I don't want to get dirty. I don't want to get in the gray. I want to just like keep these worlds apart. And it gets too hard to talk about if we mush them all together. And I get that, but just because it's hard doesn't mean it's the wrong way to talk about it.
So I'm still not sure. I think this has been helpful for me to talk this out from my perspective, even though I've said competing things.
Pat therapy.
Pat therapy. Yeah, thank you for being my therapist. But as we go forward with this show, we had a comment last week, and somebody was kind of on the same wavelength as us, as we were trying to stay focused, but there were a bunch of different touch points and tangential things that we could have gotten off on rabbit trails on. And so going forward on this show, a question I'm asking to you, but also to you listening, how should we compartmentalize issues. I mean, we're trying to keep these episodes 30, 35 minutes.
Right.
And so we can't touch on all of those different things in one episode. We could take multiple episodes to talk about it.
Right.
But by the time we get to the fourth episode, who knows what the time will have brought to the situation. So I guess my question is more general for this podcast. Do you think there's how should we compartmentalize, or should we, it is kind of fly by the seat of our pants and talk about it as it comes, but we do have a focus for each episode.
Right.
So is that wrong? Should we be doing something different?
I mean, I don't know. For me personally, like, I totally appreciated the feedback about the kind of the tangentialness of last week's episode. But that's how my brain works. So I guess, if you guys have specific feedback about, any of the episodes, we'd love to hear that. And if one way or another really resonates with more people, I think we can definitely focus in. But I'm assuming, just based on the quality of people and the differences, that there's probably some of both. That sometimes that really focus and specific and drilling in kind of conversation is going to really resonate. And there are probably other people out there like me that prefer the, like, how does this all fit together? How do we continue to have this conversation in a broad way and understand that, the issue wasn't tennis for Serena Williams. And it's not, a lot of these, the issue isn't kneeling for Colin Kaepernick, I mean,
Right.
if you want to get really specific, so we have to understand that's like everything that we do has meaning beyond the surface. And I think sometimes people need to have that conversation about the layers of meaning. And, take the Colin Kaepernick thing, for example, and to him it meant one thing, and to other people it meant something else. And if we don't have that discussion about what it was originally intended versus how you perceive it, how will some people know? And really unpacking, like, why does Colin see it as an important thing to do on a platform we're standing on? Why do other people see that as disrespectful? Where is the disconnect between those two? And how do we resolve that so that we are all on the same page? Because ultimately, in my mind, I think everybody's kind of fighting for the same thing. We just fight for, like, in that specific circumstance, it's getting fought for from different angles that don't know how to talk to each other very well. And if we don't talk about both sides of that and how each of those is ultimately looking for the same thing, which, how are we ever going to get to that agreed on the mutual understanding of a plan for the future,
Of how to make progress.
right?
Yeah, I think progress is the name of the game.
Right.
Whether we're talking about a single issue, or whether we're talking about a complex issue. And that's kind of going back to my compartmentalization. I see progress as progress in any one of those areas.
Sure.
Like, if it's worth it to boil it down to one issue and talk about that, then progress in that one issue is progress for the whole thing.
Sure.
Even though progress might not be made immediately in another facet of what we're talking about. Right. But, and fully realizing that, and this is I think a lot of the problem that we have when we're having these conversations, is we want a solution that fixes it all right now. And it's got to fix it all. It can't just, like, we're less okay with small steps in the right direction, and we need it to solve our problem. And it's like all or nothing. If this doesn't fix everything right now, then I can't get behind this.
Right.
We need to come up with something different. And I think that happens on both sides. Like, people who are working to fix the issue are going, I don't want a small step. I see a way to fix this whole thing, and I think we should do that.
Right.
But then people who are fighting against that, I think, do the same exact thing. This isn't going to fix it, so why even try?
Right.
sort of mentality. And I think we get stuck there on these complex issues. And I don't know, maybe part of my compartmentalization of it is wanting to see some sort of progress in some area
Hmm.
of these discussions.
Well, I think you bring up a good point because I don't think we always realize in these discussions how much of a Amazon mentality we have when it comes to these conversations. And the truth is, like, a lot of these issues are tens, 20s, if not hundreds of years worth of baggage that we're
Yeah.
trying to unpack, and we can't expect that to change in a 10-minute conversation with our coworker. Nor should it. I mean, that's not, we've put in a lot of crap to make the problem, and we have to do the work to fix it. And so I think that that's a piece too, is like, is it maybe not compartmentalizing in that way, but like, are we trying to put everything into a box and have a happy little present of a solution,
Yeah.
when the truth is, like, we're gonna have to drudge through some mud to fix this problem. And I think going into these conversations with the mindset of, like, if you're going to engage in a Facebook conversation or a conversation with your coworker or your spouse or your family member, whoever it is, like, going into it with that mentality of, like, I'm going to do some work right now, and it's gonna take some effort for me to disagree gracefully, to press in when I feel uncomfortable, to um
To listen to the other side rather than just
yeah,
waiting to say something.
to see the value in what they're saying. And I think that's really where we start to take the first step, is understanding that the perspective, every single one of us brings a flawed perspective in some way or another. And I think that that's something that we've kind of forgotten. Whether it's, you know, we're slightly more likely to jump onto somebody's bandwagon quickly without listening to the full story, or, we're so passionate about social justice that we want that thing to happen so quickly, and we're willing to kind of roll people over in the way. So I think there's just that piece of, like, it's okay if it doesn't get solved right away, and being comfortable with that, and being comfortable with whatever progress we can make is all we can expect in this moment.
Right.
And then there's not that need to feel like overwhelmed because, well, we talked about 5 issues and we didn't solve all 5, which is, I think, part of what you're getting to, is like, we get ping ponged around and nothing happens. And
Yeah, we don't, because we've got so many things floating around, we don't feel like we're getting anywhere with any of them, when in reality, we are often making slow steps
mhm.
on a lot of those issues.
Well, and none of these issues, and I think that's really important for us to recognize with this group, is this is about creating clarity. It's about being more comfortable having the conversation. It's about being able to come to situations with grace. We're not going to solve anything here. And I think that that's important to recognize, like, as much as I wish we could, that wasn't ever really the intention, nor it ever will really be the intention. Our intention is to help people have conversations with people they disagree with. And
That's where the fifth of our core values comes in, is
Mhm.
shape the present. And that's the point of these conversations, is to make ourselves better right now at
Right.
having these conversations and talking about this stuff, and just being a little bit more observant about what's happening around us and how our minds process some of this information and can skew it a little bit.
Right.
And our job is to shape the present and get better with what we're doing right now. And hopefully, all of that compounded as you're trying to shape your present and other people are doing the same thing can lead to progress, more substantial overall
Right.
progress.
And truthfully, you can only control you and learning, for me, I'm hoping to be less reactive and more, open to listening and open to seeing things in a way I didn't think about it before. And I've found a lot of value from doing that in the past, and my views have changed a lot.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of things at the core that I still feel are the same, but the lens or the angle which I look at them has shifted somewhat. And I think sometimes we're so afraid of that idea that we don't want to open up and don't want to open the compartments to each other in some ways, to bring it back to that.
Sure. Okay, so as we wrap this up, we will have some of the stuff that we've talked about in question form on our Facebook group. If you're not involved in our Facebook group, we would love for you to join. It's just Renovation Theory on Facebook. Search for that. The link will also be in the show notes below, as well as some links to some of the other stuff we've talked about and some more relevant articles to the topics that we've talked about today.
Yeah, and if you haven't had a chance or haven't taken a minute to rate us on your podcast player, we'd super love for you to do that. Just helps other people find us and give us a piece of feedback and let us know what you're liking or not liking.
Yeah. So we do these every week, so make sure to subscribe on YouTube or iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever you use, so that you get that new episode every time we launch it, every Thursday. So with that, we will see you next week.